Not too long ago, Jeff Bezos made history to become the first person ever to have a net worth of over $200 billion, dollars, surpassing everybody and becoming the wealthiest person on earth. He earns about $30 million an hour, which is absurd. However, what if I told you somebody was actually worth a lot more than Jeff Bezos? A lot more. As a matter of fact, their net worth is considered by numerous experts to be unimaginable and so much that no one will, at any point, would be worth this much ever again. Today, we will talk about the fortune of Mansa Musa, Lord of Mali, the most well-off man in history. We'll investigate how he obtained his fortune. Furthermore, what exactly he burned through all that cash on. Allow your mind to go back in time to 14th century Europe. The bubonic plague is clearing across the land, crushing urban communities and killing 33% of the mainland's population. War is widespread, leaving numerous dead. The roads are loaded with trash and actual feces. Unfortunately, one of the worst times ever in history. But if you look a bit to South Africa, it's the exact opposite. The economy is booming. There were mosques being built, new universities also being built, art being made and spread all across the continent. And at the top of it is Musa Kira, the first known as Mansa Musa after he took charge of the Kingdom of Mali in 1312 BC. Under Mansa Musa's rule, the Kingdom of Mali was growing, stretching across modern-day Mali, Senegal, Guinea, Niger, Gambia, Nigeria, Chad, Burkina Faso, and Mauritania, stretching about 2,000 miles from one end to the other. And within the territory, there were resources that made Mali and Mansa Musa unbelievably wealthy. It's believed that during his reign, the Empire of Mali was in control of half of the world's gold. If there was an empire that had control of half of the world's gold today, well, from the gold alone, they would be worth more than $7 trillion. That's almost 3 times the GDP of the United Kingdom. But it wasn't just gold that Mansa Musa's empire was in control over. The Empire of Mali stretched from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to Sahara Desert, covering rainforests, plains, and all the resources that could be found within them. Much of the fortune of Mali came from salt deposits and elephant ivory, which were extremely lucrative at the time when Mansa Musa took the throne. The kingdom was already wealthy, but he took things a step, further expanding the territory to include 24 cities, taking control of towns like Timbuktu, which allowed the kingdom to trade more freely. So Mansa Musa was a fan of conquering, of the earning more resources for himself and his country. But what exactly did he do with those resources? Honestly, he liked to spend them in ways that would put Marie Antoinette and Jeff Bezos to shame. To get a real understanding of how unbelievably wealthy Mansa Musa really was, it's important to look at the most extravagant display of his fortune during his reign. In his pilgrimage to Mecca, Mansa Musa, like most of the people in Mali, was Muslim, and while many Muslims completed their pilgrimage to Mecca, no one in history has done it quite as fancy as Mansa Musa did. For starters, it wasn't just old Mansa Musa traveling through the desert on a camel. Sweating in the sun, he traveled in comfort with plush accommodations that he didn't even have to set up himself because he had an entourage. An entourage the size of a city. It's estimated that there was 70,000 people in his caravan traveling with him at all times. This caravan included 1,500 attendants, including 500 attendants that solely served his head wife. There were 500 slaves who carried something that you wouldn't necessarily expect to see in the hands of slaves. Golden staff that weighed 6 pounds each. For reference, that's 3,000 pounds of gold. But that wasn't the only gold on the journey. There were 150 camels carrying 400 pounds of gold. Each, that's around 40,000 pounds worth of gold. Total today, that's 50,000 pounds of gold, or around $800 million. With the additional cost of the golden staff, that would be equal to around $995 million, just short of a billion, and all owned exclusively by Mansa Musa. When you add in the fact that he also owned many of the people in his caravan, including thousands of slaves in attendance, well, that just adds to his worth and the extravagant display of wealth that his journey really was. The female slaves wore brocade and Yemeni silk gowns, something very few people could afford. And far from the typical clothes you'd imagine slaves to be wearing, there were also hundreds more camels who carried silk, other textiles, and supplies for the group. Along the way to Mecca, the group stopped in foreign cities and went on shopping sprees where they would buy pounds of specialty foods, expensive clothing, and confectionery treats. When the majority of Europe was starving, Mansa Musa was blowing money like there was no tomorrow. And buying things wasn't the only way he blew money. He was known for giving money to the poor. As he passed through towns and often gave money to different organizations, and though at first glance it doesn't seem like spending your wealth in towns and giving money to the poor could cause any issues. But that wasn't exactly the case here. Mansa Musa left a trail of gold behind him everywhere he went. And when he arrived in Cairo, that gold had quite an impact. Mansa Musa intended to push through Cairo on his way to Mecca, but the Sultan al-Nasir insisted that he stay and meet him. So instead, Mansa Musa stayed in the kingdom in Cairo for 4 months, spending his fortune and lounging around, enjoying the spoils that come with being a king. But upon finally leaving Cairo, the economy took a huge hit due to his generosity and extreme wealth. The incomprehensible amount of gold he left behind actually depreciated the value of gold, which took Egypt 15 years to recover from. Can you imagine being so wealthy that simply spending your money as you please could affect the economy of a mighty empire? I mean, there's Rich and there's Mansa Musa during that trip. It wasn't just his wealth that was spread. It was word of his wealth. The empire of Mali was widely unknown at the time, but became something of intrigue after the rest of the world saw the amount of money the kingdom had to burn when Mansa Musa returned to Mali. He wasn't done splurging just quite yet during his travels. He collected artists, poets, scholars, and architects, and brought them back with him, intending to grow his cities. Even more, he got to work building dozens of mosques, universities, and palaces. One particular mosque, the Jingura Bir Mosque, was commissioned by Mansa Musa. The mosque was one of the largest and most impressive in all the Africa, and has withstood the test of time as it is still standing today 800 years later. The mosque was designed by a famous architect who was paid in 440 pounds of gold, or about $8.5 million in today's money. The mosque has 3 inner courts, 2 minarets, and 25 rows of pillars that had enough prayer space for 2,000 people. At the time then, there were the universities, specifically Sankor University. Mansa Musa strongly believed in educating and advancing the citizens of his empire, so he commissioned Sankor University to facilitate. The university could house 30,000 people, which is more than Harvard University can house today. It contained one of the largest libraries in the world, rivaling the Library of Alexandria. It's believed to have contained somewhere between 400,000 and 700,000 manuscripts, though many scholars suggest there may have been up to 1 million. The scholars, artists, and scientists Mansa Musa brought back from his trips worked with the university, creating a fairly modern schedule and structure. There were 4 levels of schooling, which were the equivalent of degrees today. Students would receive special turbans upon graduating from each level, and classes involved both secular and non-secular teachings. And though Mansa Musa spent a lot of his wealth on his community, he wasn't shy about spending a little bit on himself. Though his palace no longer stands and there are no records detailing what exactly it looked like, we can take a look at palaces of nearby kingdoms to get an idea of what kind of extravagance his palace must have held. Most palaces weren't just one building. They could be the size of an entire city with audience halls, courtyards, villas, secondary palace buildings for extended royal family members, apartments for officials, and the specific royal apartment. The area for the king and his wife often included bedrooms, dressing rooms, private audience chambers, a courtyard with gardens, and a harem because that's how they did things back in the days. The palace ground also included dozens of courtyards, worship temples, and in some cases, even ceremonial lakes. And judging by how much Mansa Musa loved gold and silk, I think it's safe to say his palace was probably decorated wall to wall with the most expensive materials and surely things that he brought back from his lengthy travels. Though we don't know exactly how much Mansa Musa earned, we know one thing: his wealth was so huge that he was able to propel his kingdom far into the future. Unfortunately, that massive wealth came with a downside. Words of his fortune spread into Europe, which ended up contributing to the kingdom's downfall. By the 15th century, Portugal was conducting naval raids against the kingdom, and shortly after, the colonization of the kingdom and the continent contributed to the inevitable demise of the Mali Empire. So there you have it, how the wealthiest man in history spent his fortune. I wonder why Jeff Bezos isn't out building palaces and kingdoms all over the place. What about you guys? What would you do if you were worth hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars? Be sure to let us know in the comments down below. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to leave a thumbs up and subscribe, and maybe turn on post notifications for one time. This is Luxury Avenue. And if you don't mind me, I've got some gold to count.